Welcome to Eat, Sleep, Wine, Repeat, a podcast for all you wine lovers who, if you're like me, just cannot get enough of the good stuff. I'm Yanina Doyle, your host, brand ambassador, wine educator, and sommelier. So stick with me as we dive deeper into this ever-evolving, wonderful world of wine. And wherever you are listening to this, cheers to you. Hello, wine friends, and welcome back to a really interesting episode on Bordeaux. And so, of course, I have Jane Anson on the podcast. She is a renowned wine writer and journalist. She is known for her expertise in Bordeaux wines, has released really comprehensive books. If you haven't got Inside Bordeaux, this is your Bordeaux Bible that you have been looking for. So in this episode, we'll be talking about En Primeur and what it is and why it's such a significant event in Bordeaux. What are some of the key factors to consider when you're evaluating a Bordeaux wine during En Primeur tastings? How the prices typically compare to the eventual release price of the wines and how that might actually affect purchasing decisions? But it's not just about En Primeur. We are talking about Pétrus, one of the iconic wines of Bordeaux, going up into space and how that affects the wines. We'll also jump across to China because, well, there are some pretty impressive wines being made over there with Bordeaux varieties, and one specific wine called Ao Yang, which you may want to know about. Now, this is an excellent episode. So all it leaves me to say is thank you to my incredible sponsor, Wickham's Wine. Their link to their online retail website is in my show notes. And don't forget, if you use the code EATSLEEP10, you'll get 10% off your first order. And I have checked and they have got some lovely Bordeaux wines and some from the wonderful 2016 vintage. So go on there, grab yourself a bottle, pour yourself that glass and enjoy this episode. So what I want to ask you, the first question, was there any pivotal moments? Was there any time which sent you to Bordeaux? The reason you became a wine writer, the reason why you focused on the Bordeaux region?
I got to say there was not a sudden wake up Damascene conversion moment. I've been a journalist ever since I graduated. I spent 1 year teaching in Japan, but as soon as I left Japan, I went to Hong Kong. I was in Hong Kong at the time of the handover, which was totally awesome, being a journalist then. So doing things from sub-editing at the South China Morning Post and the Eastern Express. Eastern Express no longer exists. And then working for mainly travel magazines, and came back to London, did a master's in publishing, and then started to kind of head up these big websites at the time of the first .com boom, when you'd work for a website and there'd be 11 different channels of different content and all that kind of stuff. So it was super fun. And I'd started to, I guess you could say I was interested in wine. I'd had a really important trip to South Africa just a couple of years after apartheid had finished, when it was really a moment for me where it opened my eyes to how interesting wine can be as a subject, as a writer, because it brought together all of these different, politics and history. And it was just such a fascinating time to be in South Africa. And I think, at the time I went and visited the winelands, but I wonder if I'd have gone and visited something else in South Africa, maybe I would have been writing about that. It was just such an important trip for me to be there. Yeah, so then in London, got married, had first baby, and thought, you know what, I think maybe I'll take a year or two off. I was working full time at the time in offices. And I thought, okay, I'll take a couple of years off and just go and we'll live abroad, but we're intending fully to come back to London. And we thought, of course, and pre-Brexit, so it was super easy going to Europe. So we moved to France. And honestly, we chose Bordeaux mainly because, well, we knew there was good wine here, and I'd become interested in writing about wine. And it seemed it was either going to be Burgundy, Champagne, or Bordeaux. And in the end, we decided Bordeaux's on the right side of France for getting back to London. Super easy, an hour's flight. And my husband, Francis, was a real Bordeaux fan. He was the one, much more than me, that was really into Bordeaux wine. I was probably more into Italian wine or South African wine. And then, we moved here. It's 20 years later. And somehow, the longer we stayed, the more interesting it became. And yes, so really, I don't have a single moment. But there definitely was, after a couple of years here, I think we suddenly thought, hang on, this is actually a really great place to live. And it's so fascinating being in a region where wine is the main thing. And that's what we're writing about. So you just felt so much a part of the fabric of the region.
I love that. So, okay, we can thank Francis for actually really liking Bordeaux. Well done. But in terms of actually wine mentors or people that maybe helped you, I don't know, any influential figures in the industry that helped you dig deeper into Bordeaux, kept you in Bordeaux?
Absolutely. I think we all need those figures, and we all need to be open to to what people are kind enough to share with us. When I first moved here, luckily I knew so little about wine and about Bordeaux that I wasn't intimidated to ask questions. And because I had a journalist background, that's what your job is, to ask questions and to keep on asking questions and to not be embarrassed about things you don't know. So I think I had that good, I was open to learning. One person who had a huge influence on my career was Adam Lechmere, actually, who now is the publishing director of Académie du Vin Library, because he was the editor of Decanter.com. So when I first moved here, I basically knocked on the door of Decanter. I must have sent them an email, but I don't really remember how it happened. But I basically knocked on the door of their little, I think they were in South Kensington at the time. Anyway, and
so physically,
I literally knocked on the door, and they went up and met Adam in the office, and he basically gave me my first gig of working for Decanter at the time as a stringer, so as a freelance journalist doing news for them. And then over time, so I can definitely say Adam kind of let me get my foot in the door of writing about wine in a more serious way. And then on this side, it was Jean-Michel Cars. So Jean-Michel Cars, who passed away sadly last year, he was the owner of Lynchbarge. He was somebody who was so kind and very, 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 not just welcoming, but helpful in terms of these are the things, Jane, that you should be looking at if you're wanting to learn about Bordeaux wine. He gave me a couple of very useful textbooks, history books about Bordeaux. And maybe he gives those to many different people, but I read them all. Like I'd made the decision at that point that I'd committed to wanting to learn more. And so I did a lot of those things. There's a guy called Professor Denis de Bourdieu, who also is no longer with us, but he was a professor at the Institute of Enology here, also a chateau owner and also a consultant. He was somebody also extremely helpful to me, very open, happy to share his knowledge. And through him, I then studied at the Institute of Enology doing a thing called the Duad, which is a diploma, a tasting diploma. It lasts for a year, taught in French, just brilliant. I cannot recommend it highly enough. It is kind of like a smaller version of doing an enology degree. So you do a lot about the chemistry of wine, all the things that happen during the growing season to make wine taste the way it does. But you're also doing weekly tastings of the different chemicals, the different molecules that are in wine. So you're given this lineup every single week of maybe 10 different glasses that look like they have nothing in them, but they all have different smells or they might be different tastes, and you're isolating how a wine is made. So by the end of that year, oh my God, it was amazing. It was amazing. And I'm now teaching at the Duad. Just the last 2 years, I've been teaching at the Duad. So that's felt like a real full circle moment for me. Thank you. Yes, so he was amazing. And then just one last person, although, there are many, 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 but one last person I should mention, also through Decanter, in 2014, Sarah Kemp, who was the publishing director of Decanter, she asked me if I wanted to join their team as being part of I was already Bordeaux correspondent by then, but she asked me to come on board as the En Primeur taster. And 2 years after that, I became the sole En Primeur taster. So Sarah was really very just believed in me. So she was somebody who had a big influence on my career as well.
Do you know, I think it's so important when you have those people, I think, like you just said, so kind to just give up their time and to share their knowledge. So has that kind of partly been maybe the reason why you've set up this Bordeaux Mentor Week? Has that been a bit of the inspiration?
Oh, absolutely it has been. When I left Decanter, so in 2021, after really 18 years with Decanter, I decided to leave and set up my own website. Easy to remember it, janeanson.com. But I did it because, I felt it was the right time. So I'd been here for long enough that I knew I had very good knowledge of this region. I'd written a couple of books by that point, especially this big Inside Bordeaux book, which came out in 2020. And I started to look around and I thought, there isn't a site out there which deals just with Bordeaux. And this is such an important region globally. There are quite a few about Burgundy, but there wasn't one about Bordeaux. And it seemed like the right time and that I was somebody who could do it. But I wanted right from the start for it to be about something more than just another website with another person talking about what wines they like. I wanted it to be really something more interesting and important in terms of part of community. So yes, as you said, I straight away thought I want to do something which is giving back at the same time that I'm trying to launch something. I want to kind of help other people to also find their path. And so I asked a friend of mine who's called Chinedu Rita Rosa, and she's a Nigerian wine importer here. She's a really fantastic woman. And I asked her what she thought about us joining together and running this mentor week, which was always not for profit. So it's underwritten by a few charity foundations, such as the Gerard Bassett Foundation and the IWSC Foundation, so both in the UK. And they have helped us to pay for the flights and transport around the region for these group of, first year it was 6, I think. Second year it was 7. This year it's the third year, it's 8. So people from around the world. It doesn't necessarily, they don't have to be young, but they tend to be, the oldest we've had so far has been 32 or 33, and the youngest, somebody who's been 19. Most people who come are in their 20s. But what we're looking for is people who are starting their career. They've already shown that they have interest in wine, but there's something that is holding them back from being able to move on to the next part of their career. So whatever barriers it might be, or a bias, or it might be financial restraints, there's many different reasons. And so they apply, and it's just been the most rewarding thing I think I've ever done. So among the people that we've had so far, we've had wonderful people who work in wine stores in Puerto Rico, in India, in Nigeria. They might be young sommeliers, South Africa. They're really all over the world. It's just been incredible. I think we've had 65 different countries, people from 65 different countries applying to come on this week. And our next one this year is in September. So it's great. It's like a real boot camp. They basically spend the week getting to know all the different aspects of the Bordeaux system. And our aim is not in any way for them to leave as ambassadors for Bordeaux. It's not about that. It's about them coming to Bordeaux and learning the many insights that you can get in Bordeaux, which is going to help them with their own careers back wherever they would like to be. And we aim to make this more of a long-term program as well. So from this year, the Wine Scholar Guild is giving them access to their Bordeaux study program. So that will help on a longer term for them to increase their knowledge about this region. But also a couple of wine estates are offering to help them maybe do a 2 weeks work experience in the wineries or longer. So we try to make it not just about the week here, but this is the starting point for them to kind of continue their careers.
Amazing. And to be honest, I even just looked at the little bit of the itinerary and I'm like, wow, it's really behind the scenes. It's a little bit of winemaking, it's tasting, it's understanding, I guess, La Place de Bordeaux.
Yeah. And because I've been here for so long, I really make sure that they meet people who really know what they're talking about. And also I screen out to make sure it's people who are also, like I said before, who are kind, who are open, who are not going to be holding anything back, but who truly want to share. So the networking opportunities are pretty cool.
Honestly, I love it. Wine has to be shared. We should be sharing it with everybody and making sure that everyone can be as involved in wine as possible. So actually, I love it when I get to segue. I get to now go to your book. That's where you're sharing all of your knowledge. I mean, you've contributed to loads of books. You've written other books as well. But is the pride and joy the Inside Bordeaux book?
Well, Inside Bordeaux is something where I'm going to show you something kind of hilarious here. If people are just listening to this rather than looking, I'm showing my cover, which is 100% come off of my Inside Bordeaux, because I use it personally so much. Because who the hell can remember all of the facts that are in that book? I certainly can't. So I find it so useful. I always have it and I'll flick through to remember certain things about estates. So yes, I think this was really a lot of work. It was 3 years full in terms of research from beginning to end, research and writing. But it was also the 10 or 15 years that I'd been here before that. So I love that book. But I have to say, I think the book that I'm the most proud of in terms of how it changed my career is the first wine book that I wrote. So I'd been the contributor to various other books. I'd written a few travel books. But the first wine book I wrote, that's called Bordeaux Legends, which came out in 2010 or 2011, I can't remember exactly. That book I'm proud of because I had no publisher, I had no background. I had got an agent, but the agent didn't actually end up getting me a publisher, so I just did it myself.
Oh, good for you.
And I just feel, I know, I look back and I think, I can't believe that I did it.
Yeah, this is me. Yeah. This is what I did.
Yeah, and I really feel like, I thought, it's a book about why the first growth became the first growth. So why these 5 chateaux out of the 7,000 chateaux in Bordeaux, why were they the ones that became those 1855 first growths? And I thought, why has this book not been written before? There are individual histories of all of those 5 chateaux, so Lafite, Mouton, Margaux, Aubryon, and Latour, but there'd never been one looking at how they were together. So anyway, so doing that, and then when I finally got a publisher, who actually, I should say, Aubryon put me in touch with somebody in Paris that's called Edition de la Martinière. They had no influence on it, except to say, here's a number in Paris. So I went to them. Anyway, and the woman she's called La Martinière, said to me, okay, if you can sell 2,000 copies of this book, then we will kind of agree. We want to have a pre-sale before we agree to publish it. And I'm a writer, I had no idea how to sell anything, but I was so determined that this book was going to be published that I just picked up the phone and I called various negociants and various wine shops in different countries and basically hand sold 10 books at a time, then 20 books, then maybe 50 books. And eventually I got to the 2,000 number that I had to get to. I think I got to about 1,850 and Corinne took pity on me and said, okay, we'll do it. We'll publish.
Oh, well, no, that makes me so happy.
Yeah, it was great. And I love that also because I think for everybody who wants to write books, it's something which so many of us is such a dream. It was such a dream for me since I was little. And to think, you can get there. Sometimes you just have to be very bloody minded about it, but you can get there.
Yes. So the moral of the story is reach for the stars, which allows me now to ask you about tasting Pétrus up in space. I mean, I don't know. I don't know if I was going to be able to do it, but
such a professional.
I just did. So now we get to talk about... Now we get to talk about Pétrus. I'm so jealous. I heard about Pétrus going up into space for, I think it was like 14 months. This is the 2000 vintage, which is a pretty good vintage as well. So when it came back down to Earth, you got to taste it, right?
So this is amazing. Really, really. Of all of the things, like wine, you work in wine. It can take you all over the world. Such an incredible thing to work in, just from the amazing people you meet and who knows where you're going to end up. But this is not something I ever would have imagined I was going to end up doing. So I think I was probably sat exactly where I'm sat now, because this is at my desk with my computer where I spend a lot of my time. And I got a phone call from a friend of mine who's a negociant. And he said, I've just put your name forward for an unusual tasting. Just be prepared. You're going to get a call. Anyway, so I got a call and was not told what the wine was. We didn't know what the wine was until after the tasting, but I was told it was an important wine and that it had spent 14 months up on the International Space Station. And so me, like you, like all of us, have the International Space Station, the pictures of the astronauts floating around and whatever. It was just completely insane to think that this was going to happen. But it was connected to, I talked about doing the duad at the Institute of Enology here in Bordeaux. It was connected to that. And that's really why they asked me above other journalists, because they knew that I had followed this very particular kind of tasting, which you learn during the duad, which is called this triangular tasting, where you have 3 wines in front of you, 2 are the same and 1 is different. And that's a very typical way of tasting at the Institute of Enology. So it's all blind, but you know that 2 are the same and 1 is different. And all you have to do is identify which one is different. So that is how we approach this wine in space, because what they were trying to see was there any, obviously they also did chemical analysis and they did a lot of studies into it, but they wanted to know from a tasting point of view, was anything different? So there were 11 of us at the tasting. There were 2 people who had put money in, so part of the people who'd funded the trip. There was this guy called Nicolas Gaume. He was the creator of this whole idea. Now, he is kind of seen as the French Elon Musk, basically. He'd done a lot of startups in tech. And at some point along the way, had the crazy idea to send wine up into the International Space Station, and a partner of his did it with him. So there were these two who were from the company. Then there was the mayor of Bordeaux, a guy called Pierre Urmic. So he'd somehow got in on the tasting, but as you would if you were in Bordeaux and you were the mayor of the city. Then there were, I think, 3 or 4 scientists, so people who worked at the Institute of Enology, and then me. Probably missing a couple, but basically that's what it was. I was the only journalist there. And we had this wine came in and we had them in front of us, these 3 wines, and half of us had 2 space wines and 1 earth wine. And the other half had 2 earth and 1 space. We didn't know, obviously, which one of us had what. And we just had to taste. And although obviously we did tasting notes, but our main job was to say which wine is different. And I'm very happy to say that I could tell quite quickly which wine had been in space. Not everybody in the room did, but I think that's why there weren't that many professional tasters. It was about half of us were professional tasters and half weren't. And for me, it seemed pretty obvious that the one, I didn't know if it was space or earth, but I knew one looked more mature than the others. It looked like it was a little bit older than the other 2. So I picked that one as being the space wine, and it was the space wine. And then afterwards, we were told it was Pétrus 2000.
Okay, amazing. But so my question, you said, okay, this one tastes older, more mature. With 0 gravity, why would you decide that an older, more mature style is the one from space?
Well, I guess I was deciding it was different. I mean, I might have had the 2 space wines on my room and one was younger. And one was earth. It's just I had to choose which one was different. I chose one which was different, and it turned out that was the space one. It's probably a more accurate way to put it. But now that I look back on it, maybe it's so hard to know. And they haven't yet released the full results of the actual chemical analysis. But I assume it could also be because no matter how careful they are, think of the force that's going up. And as you're leaving the Earth and you're going up to the International Space Station, that is a huge amount of movement and power and force. So it may be
severe bottle shock.
You'd imagine severe bottle shock. So you would imagine that could have some impact on why it seemed a little bit more mature than the Pétrus that had stayed on Earth. I don't know. What I do know was it was fabulously fun to be part of that tasting. It was really, not many things you can say is a once in a lifetime, but that was definitely a once in a lifetime experience.
Amazing. Well, I know that they ended up selling at least 1 bottle at, I think, Christie's auction, but also with an earth Pétrus 2000. So whoever got that, wow. And what would be amazing is almost to resist and then try and taste it in, I don't know, another decade or 20 years. And like what happens then? Because that's just so unusual. It's not a known thing, is it?
No, it's not. And what's interesting actually since then is Nicolas Gaume, the guy who I talked about, the French Elon Musk, he has now set up, I can't remember the name of it now, but a company that deals with space tourism. So he's remained in the space, as it were, the space area. I mean, there was a lot of interesting, they sent little vines up into the space station as well. So a lot of the idea was to look at climate change and how to make sure you can build more resistant plants. And so there's certainly some scientific value. The International Space Station and NASA wouldn't have accepted it if that wasn't the case. But I also think it was a brilliant piece of media for him to then launch his space tourism program.
How curious, how interesting. Now, for anybody who actually, we're talking Pétrus, and they're thinking, well, hang on a minute, so this is an amazing wine. What is Pétrus? What for you, obviously, it's 100% Merlot, which I love as well, because, Merlot sometimes doesn't get as premium reputation as it should. And this wine certainly shows that. But what for you is special about Pétrus, in your opinion?
Yeah, it's funny. When Pétrus was chosen as the wine, I thought it was a very smart choice. There are very few wines in the world that you can choose that would have that kind of media impact. I guess in Bordeaux, is there really another one? I mean, Lafite, etc., perhaps. But something about Pétrus, it's also quite small production. I think one of the reasons that I appreciate Pétrus so much is that it is a real reflection of a place. It's a true, often Bordeaux can be accused of, these huge sprawling estates. Do they really have a sense of place? I would argue yes in most cases, but Pétrus, you don't really have those arguments. It is relatively small, I think it's 10 hectares, 11 hectares, but it is on a plot of land which is almost entirely this very unusual, kind of very dense, sticky clay, which is quite different from the rest of its appellation. So the appellation is Pomerol. Pomerol itself is an appellation that everybody loves. But Pétrus is on a specific kind of soil which you just don't find in really anywhere else in Pomerol. There's a couple tiny little spots of it in other parts of the region, but very, very little. There's a very famous estate that's right opposite Pétrus that is called Le Fleur. And I love, if only we could all afford it, which sadly most of us can't, but if you can taste Le Fleur against Pétrus, you understand a lot about terroir. You understand a lot about the influence of place, because you can walk between those two estates within really 1 minute, 2 minutes maximum. But Le Fleur has got much more gravel and clay in its soil. And then Pétrus has this pure clay. And you see the difference. Le Fleur is much more kind of ethereal in many ways. It's quite serious. And then Pétrus is this dense, gorgeously sexy, incredible wine, which is, so they're so close and yet they're so different. And you taste them both. I say the same thing if you go on the left bank in Pauillac, if you taste Latour against Lafite, same thing. Latour has much more clay in its soil, still with gravel, but much more clay. Lafite is almost pure gravel. And same thing, you see Lafite is very elegant, full of finesse, kind of takes its time, will age forever. Latour is much more of a powerhouse. And again, same thing, these two very famous wines, they're both seen as the same level, often the same price, and yet their taste is so different, same appellation. And I think those two pairs of wines in Bordeaux are a great way to talk about the fact that Bordeaux does have a sense of place.
Yeah, incredible. Yeah. Just because you touched on this very special sticky kind of clay, in the textbooks, they say blue clay. I've not been. Is it actually got a blue tinge? Is there something blue about it?
Yeah, there is. I love that question. And you will find everybody in Bordeaux will say they have a bit of blue clay. I mean, if I had €1 for every chateau that told me they have blue clay in their vineyard, but most of them will have, they might have some blue clay, to be fair. They might, but it'll be at a lower level. It won't have the same. The thing about Pétrus is the extent of it that they have and the true depth of it. But yes, you'll see genuinely bits of blue. You might see bits of red in other types of clay. Some of them, they're just gorgeous colors. One of the things I did with the book, I put a big emphasis in the book on terroir and soils and what impact it has in the glass. Like what matters really is what does that mean in terms of how the wine's going to taste. Anyway, so I spent a lot of time in soil pits with various experts, kind of looking and trying to understand it. And yeah, some of them are just gorgeous, these myriad colors, like a rainbow of clay underneath the earth. It's lovely.
Amazing. But okay, before we go into En Primeur and Bordeaux, the actual main subject of this episode, I just want to hop across to China just for a second. Why not? Because, of course, they are actually doing some really interesting things all across China now. But there is this very famous wine, which I am yet to taste, which is a Bordeaux blend, Aoyun. But again, it's a complete different climate, different altitudes. And I know that you've obviously tasted this wine. So this is probably another perfect example. You can take the same grape varieties, but terroir is super important. So tell me, when I was asking you about certain wine memories, you brought up this Aoyun wine. So for you, what are your thoughts on this Chinese Bordeaux blend?
So I think one thing that I've been so grateful, again, to wine and to Bordeaux wine for with my career is it managed to bring back, like I'd lived in Hong Kong before, so I'd traveled quite a lot in China when I was in my 20s. And then you come to Bordeaux and who would have thought, but about the same time that I came to Bordeaux, or maybe 5 years later, China became a bigger and bigger part of the Bordeaux story. And you suddenly had, from 2008 onwards particularly, this great influx of Chinese money coming in, which we can talk about with the En Primeurs later because it had a big impact in En Primeur. Anyway, and then all of a sudden, again, maybe 5 years later than after that, the story of Chinese people coming into Bordeaux to be buying, and then all this wine being made in China. I actually just earlier this year was at the first Chinese wine awards that were being held in Macau. I was a judge in the awards, and we tasted wines from maybe 80 or 100 different wine estates around China. So super, super interesting things happening right now in China in the wine industry. But yes, so particularly with Aoyun, Aoyun owned by LVMH. So right from the start, they had the money which you needed to be able to invest in making what they call the Chinese first growth. So they were looking to make a Chinese first growth, spent a couple of years looking at every site, really, truly dozens and dozens and dozens of different sites around China, studying the climate, studying the soils, seeing where could possibly work, and ended up at this I don't think I've ever been anywhere as beautiful when looking at vineyards, this incredible place called the Meili Mountains, and they're up in the Himalayas at about 2,000 meters, 2,200 meters. We flew, it was just such an adventure, the trip. We flew from, I guess, Bordeaux to Paris, Paris to Beijing, Beijing to somewhere in Yunnan, and then from Yunnan up to Shangri-La. So the name of the place is called Shangri-La, which itself is kind of a made-up name truly from the novel, which they gave to this place wanting to help the tourism. I don't know when they named it, maybe 15, 20 years ago. I'd have to go back and read my own article to remember when they named it. But anyway, and then when we arrived at Shangri-La, we then drove up another 4 hours up into the mountains. We had oxygen in our car in case any of us got sick because it was so high. We didn't. We were totally fine. And then we arrived in this. It was just so beautiful. All the villages had these kind of Buddhist prayer. It's very close to the Tibetan border. Obviously, you're not allowed to say that when you're there, but very close to the Tibetan border. And so you had all these wonderful prayer flags at the outskirts of all of the villages, and walked around, and it was just wonderful. And that was at the beginning. I think the first vintage was 2013, and I was there in 2015. So they hadn't released the first wine yet at that point when I was there. Jancis Robinson had been, and I was the second journalist, I think, at this point. Anyway, it was just a wonderful project, and I followed it ever since. And the thing that's been interesting for me, and I think it's kind of reflected the way the wine world has changed a bit, is that it started off as being a very good Cabernet, but quite maybe Napa style, a lot of oak. It was never overpowering. I thought it was good from the beginning, but I didn't necessarily get a feel for where it was from. It felt like a very good, high quality Cabernet Sauvignon. But if you taste it today, and really from 2019 onwards, they started stripping a lot of that back and realized, what's the benefit of them being there? The benefit is this incredible altitude that they have. And also it's all organic because everything has to be done by hand. Everything has to be done themselves. The guy, Maxence, who's making the wine, is like the handyman of all handymen, because if anything breaks, he's got to be able to fix it himself. You can't get a plumber in if something goes wrong. You can't get an electrician in. He had to be able to do all of these things himself. So you're surrounded by this natural beauty. And now you taste the wine and you can tell all of the different kind of herbs, and you can tell, you feel that there's a Cabernet which has got this incredible influence of altitude and of its biodiversity and where it's from. So it's a beautiful wine. I really, really think it's very good quality. And I feel like it's so much better now. It's only been a decade really, and I love the progression. And I think it's really been by saying, let's let the place shine. Again, it's coming back to that idea of they have such a singular identity to this estate. Don't cover it up by putting in too much new oak and making it like any other Cabernet.
Interesting. Okay, well, for anybody who wants to try this wine, I Googled, and depending on the vintage, in England, you might be able to find one or two for 250, but otherwise it's about 350. So a little bit of an outlay.
Actually, that's a good point. Something they've just done in the last year or so is they've introduced village wines. So the wine itself is from 4 different villages, and they're all at different altitudes, all Cabernet Sauvignon. I think there might be a couple of other varieties now, but basically it's 100% Cabernet Sauvignon. Anyway, and so there is a cheaper entry, but think of it like they say, like a Burgundy cru. So you can get wines from each of those 4 villages, plus the Aoyun, which is the main one. So that is a way to get a taste of it without having to spend £250.
Great. Good advice. I'm going to look at that afterwards. Now, moving back to Bordeaux, we're recording this just after what has probably been your busiest, craziest, I would say week, but probably month. And that is because of En Primeur. Now, some people listening who are just wine lovers will go, actually, what the hell is En Primeur? Why is it so significant? Can you explain its importance to everyone listening?
It's basically a way to buy Bordeaux wine as a future. So to buy Bordeaux wine before it is bottled, you'll be buying the wine about 6 months after it's been harvested and turned into wine. But while it's still in barrel at the chateaus, So you're buying it. It ends up being approximately 12 months before it's going to be released to the market. The aim, in theory, is about cash flow for the chateaus. That's really where it started to get, because again, these are big estates. They are storing the wine themselves at the estates until it's bottled and then sent off. So that's an awful lot of inventory that they are kind of keeping at the estate. And so over time, buying En Primeur was a way to kind of ensure cash flow. For those of us who are buying, for us, the idea would be that we can secure the wines we want at a good price, in theory, and have access to wines that maybe we couldn't otherwise get.
In theory, we're smiling and laughing at that point.
Yes, because, so if you look at, let's think Bordeaux En Primeur as it stands now, really started in the early 1980s. So if we look back at, how many years is that? 40 years about. There have been some vintages when people have made a lot of money from this system. So people who are purchasing for buying at a good price, and then the wine has gone up hugely. But it's become more and more difficult to do that. And in the last 5 years, particularly with the financial crises that we've lived through over the last 5 years, there probably isn't a single vintage that you can't buy today at the price it was released at En Primeur. So if that happens too much and for too long, it negates the whole point of having En Primeur. It becomes about cash flow for the chateaus, but not with the other half of that bargain, which is that those of us who are buying the wines get a good price.
It's still going on, though. Is that because the hope is that the world settles and things kind of go back to the way they were?
Yeah, it's still going on because in a way it works. It's a good way to buy wine. So if we think, again, go back to that number, maybe 7,000 chateaus in Bordeaux, there's only about 200, 250 that are sold En Primeur. So this is not the whole of Bordeaux. Most of Bordeaux wine is sold the way that every other wine in the world is sold, which is once it's in bottle, it goes to a shop or you buy it directly from the estate and that's how it gets to you. But it's these bigger, these kind of classified chateaus or these more famous chateaus that sell in this way. I often think of En Primeur as being like you're at the beginning of the tennis season and you've got the ATP rankings and some chateaus are going up, some tennis players are going up, some tennis players are going down, some have had injuries, some are coming back. It's a great way to take a look at those main chateaus in Bordeaux and kind of take a health check. Who's doing well? How have they done in this latest vintage? Who's bought? Who's sold? Who's got a really cool new winemaker? Like, it's a really great way, if you're an observer of the Bordeaux wine scene, to check in, download a lot of information really, really quickly and keep up to date and to follow some of the exciting. So if I think in the last 5 or 10 years, there are a couple of chateaus like Pichon Comtesse, Carmo Briand, Trolong Mondo, Chateau Canon. There's 4 estates that have seen their fortunes dramatically rise over the last decade. That doesn't mean they're new estates. They've been there for many centuries, particularly Pichon Comtesse, but they've had exciting things happening to them. And you've seen it through tasting the wines every year En Primeur, and you've seen it through the prices, and you've seen it through the buzz of the market. So it's a nice way to check in. And from Bordeaux's point of view, and I don't know if they always appreciate this, it is such a gift for them because, again, comparing it to other things, it's like the fashion week in Paris or Milan or New York or whatever. It's a time when everybody is looking at this region and talking about it. So it's a fantastic PR press move for Bordeaux. And it's why it can be so frustrating when they can get the prices so wrong. And just to bring this back into China at this point, when the wheels really started to come off the wagon was when the Chinese market came in so strongly and so quickly. So 2008, Hong Kong got rid of all taxes on wine. And there was a general financial crisis in the world, obviously we all remember. So just at almost exactly the same time, Bordeaux had 2 fantastic vintages, 2009 and 2010. And they had this new market, which was hungry for wine and had the money to pay for it. And everything just went completely crazy. And Bordeaux put up their prices a lot for 2009 and then almost doubled them again in some cases for 2010, to the point that they were crazy prices and they're still recovering. Honestly, they are. They made a big mistake of thinking, oh, great, we've got a new market. We're not going to worry about any of our old markets. We're just going to basically take what we can. And it was very, very, very stupid miscalculation. So 2010, which is a wonderful vintage, most of the prices now are just back up. They dropped so much once the Chinese kind of realized that they were being taken advantage of a little bit, I would say, honestly. And anyway, the Chinese politics changed. So many things changed in China. So there was much less of a demand and the prices dropped. And it really, I think that those 2 years, 9 and 10, changed people's view of En Primeur and became much more cynical about En Primeur. And we're seeing the results still.
Honestly, it's so, for me, you know, I'm like, hey, I love wine and culture and history and people. And you think, actually, this is, you know, Bordeaux, the model, the intricacies. There's so many parts to the puzzle, cogs in the wheel. It's, for me, even being in the industry for well over a decade, that as you're talking to me, I'm like, what? Really? Okay. You know, so many questions come up, but we won't have time to go through them all.
I agree. It's so interesting. No, I know, you're right. And the thing that I really do like about living here is exactly that. There's so many different parts of the wine world where a lot of them is modeled on what has happened here over the centuries. So one of the things that I wanted to do with the Mentor Week is to give this kind of fast track way to get a lot of this information, which then helps put so many other wine regions into context. And you're like, oh, now I understand why they're doing this, that, and the other. And maybe they can avoid some of the mistakes maybe that have been made here. And I don't know, it brings so many different threads of the wine industry together.
Okay, so explain to me and everybody listening the week so we can just understand what you do and how does it work. Because as far as I believe, you can go and visit individual chateaus, but you can also go to kind of, I don't know what, a hall and taste loads there as well. Like, how does it work that week? What do you do?
Oh, my goodness me. Okay, so it is in April. It's normally the last week of April, and maybe 5,000 wine professionals from around the world come. You have to have an invitation, so you can't just kind of rock up to En Primeur. You have to be a professional of some description. Most people are wine buyers. There are probably around 150 journalists. Most people are wine buyers who come, and a lot of sommeliers probably come as well. Anyway, and so for that week, there's various different groups who will organize joint tastings. So as you say, you'll probably go to a hall and you will have 150 different wines or 200 different wines in that hall, and you can taste it all and take your notes. The big estates, the classified estates, the ones like Lafite, Latour, etc., they will never join those joint tastings. They ask you to go to the chateau and taste directly with their winemaker. And again, you have to have an appointment. You're probably starting to make the appointments in January for April. If you leave it too late, you're not going to get the appointments that you want. You've got to start very early. So for me, my April looks like this. So I start tasting at least 2 weeks before that main week, because I have to write a report where I'm covering maybe 800, maybe 1,000 wines, but probably about 800 wines. And I cannot do all of that in a week. No way. It's just no way. So I start normally 2 weeks before. And my day will maybe start at maybe 7:30. I'll probably get to a chateau for 8:30 will be my first thing. And I'll be tasting through till 6:30 or 7 at night. And you'll go from chateau to chateau. And at each chateau, you're tasting maybe 4 or 5 different wines. I don't drive, I'd like to say, because even if of course you're spitting, of course you are, but you're still tasting a lot of wines in a day. So for the last couple of years, I've had this wonderful woman called Julia, who works for Wine Searcher, who has been with me for the En Primeur. And so she's driving, and she's also helping me with all the logistics, because for each one of these wines, you have to know their blend, you have to know the alcohol, you have to know how much oak, how long have they been in oak for. Because what I'm doing is I'm not tasting these wines for my own interest. I'm tasting them because my subscribers want to know which ones should they buy. Is it worth investing the money in them? Which ones have done best in that particular year? So a lot of my work will begin even before those tastings, when I'll be looking at what was the weather like, what parts of Bordeaux had the most rain, who had the least rain, who might have done well, so you're kind of trying to get a lot of background before you start the tasting. And then you have all of this technical information that you're putting together with what the wines taste like. And then at the end of those 3 weeks of pretty intense tasting, I will then start writing my report. This year, because wines were coming out very quickly, I wrote the report and turned it around in 7 days, published it a week later, and then I can relax. The hardest bit is writing the report. That is for sure.
Okay, so say when you're tasting the wines, considering these are super, super young wines and you're rating them and saying, hey, should you buy this wine or not? How are you evaluating them? What are the key factors? What is the criteria for you to be considering?
So the number one factor is not, do they taste good today? Because as you say, they're not finished. They're still in barrel. And they are probably, for most of these wines, won't be drunk for another 5 to 10 to 15 to even 20 years. So I think number one thing is, in many ways, it's crazy tasting En Primeur. I do also taste when everything is in bottle. So I'll do a second tasting in bottle. But because of the way this Bordeaux system works, and again, because of the amount of money that is tied up in Bordeaux, I do believe that it's an important role to have someone who's independent, who's coming in and saying what they're like. Because, of course, every chateau is going to say their wine is fantastic and they dodged all the bullets of every, too much rain or hail or whatever. Of course they are. And so I hope that there is a value of somebody who is independent. My website, I don't have investors. I'm not being paid to taste. That's really important to say. My website is purely on subscriber. That's where I get my income from, is the subscribers to my site. So that's who I am answering to, is to my subscribers and what they think. So what I'm looking at, this is where the duad, that tasting diploma, is just so helpful, because what you're looking at is the structure of a wine. So a young wine, particularly a wine like a Bordeaux wine, there's going to be a lot of tannins, which are the things that give the wine. They might be a bit drying sometimes when they're young, but they give that wine structure. They give the ability to age. You've got acidity in a wine. This is an area which is by the ocean. One of the reasons that Bordeaux wines can last for 40, 50, 60 years is because this is an oceanic climate. If there's water, there's probably going to be freshness and acidity in your glass. And we're a relatively northern, things are changing, of course, with climate change, but it's you're kind of just on the most northerly part of southern France, I think is a good way to think about Bordeaux. So in theory, again, that gives wines which are fresh and which can age. So you're looking at tannins, you're looking at acidity, and you're looking at fruit. You want the wine to have structure because it's young, but that means nothing if there's not enough fruit for it to taste good and for it to age over the long term and still have fruit in the wine. So you're kind of like an architectural question, like how is that wine? What's the shape of the wine? If there's your little triangle of acidity, tannins, and fruit, how's that fitting together? And one of the things you're looking at is anything jumping out too much? Like, is the alcohol too high? If there's too much alcohol, then everything might feel a bit hot. And then you're thinking that's going to drown out the elegance and the fruit over the long term. You're trying to think not about what it's tasting like today. You're trying to think of projecting yourself forward of how it's going to age. And it is not easy. That honestly, it sounds like it would be so fun to taste wines for 3 weeks nonstop, but it is really a job. It's hard, and you have to take breaks. You have to have water. Got to drink water. I'm somebody who likes to have bread or crackers while I'm tasting as well, because I don't want too much tannic build-up. It's fun, and you see people from around the world that you haven't seen since the last En Primeur. That's the lovely social part of En Primeur. But most nights I want to go home, drink water, and collapse on the sofa.
And I fully support that, honestly, because as well, for me, when after tasting 50 wines at a tasting, everything's fluffy and furry, and nothing I drink or eat kind of takes that away from my mouth. And you said about getting a driver. Yes, we're not swallowing, but actually I always get, if I've done a really serious tasting, a little bit of a headache. I must be consuming a little bit. I don't know whether the alcohol goes to my head, but it's always a very enjoyable experience to taste amazing wines. But it's really hardcore, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And I think we should not pretend otherwise, that there's alcohol in the wines that you're tasting. And so being sensible about it is definitely important.
My question, I think maybe kind of going back, and I don't know how, is there an answer now? The prices in which the chateaus decide to release their wines at the time after En Primeur, how does that compare to full-on release when they're actually available to buy? How does it change? I don't even know how to ask that question because I'm just so confused about it all.
So let's think about, how do they arrive at their prices? So the chateaus will have started to think about the price right from the moment of the harvest. So that will be like their first question is it a good year? We wish that would be the only question, but it's definitely not. But so they're starting to think at the time of harvest, what yield is it? Like, how much wine have they produced? Is it a good wine? Is the quality good? And then between that point and En Primeur, they're starting to think, okay, what's the general wider market like? How much could the market bear? So like, has there been a massive crash like in 2008? Has there been COVID like in the 2020 for the 2019 vintage? What's happened globally? So one of the things I always say to people who are interested in Bordeaux is they need to also be interested in economics. They need to follow what is happening globally in economics, because the thing that's also interesting about Bordeaux is where the top wines go tends to be wherever the dominant financial center is at that time. And you see it throughout history. So 2008 is a great example of that. So 2008, we had this global financial crisis, but at the same time, Hong Kong dropped its tax on wine and the Chinese market came in. And the Chinese market made up for the fact that most other places in the world were not buying because of the 2008 financial crisis. So there's a great example of how politics came into the prices of Bordeaux. Today, we've had COVID and we've had a general economic crisis, and China is not there for Bordeaux anymore. You've seen after COVID, the numbers of imports from Bordeaux to China, or exports from Bordeaux to China, they haven't come back to where they were. And so prices that Bordeaux is releasing at right now, they're much more conscious of the fact that there isn't a magic bullet out there in the world which is coming in to take everything. So I don't think we're going to see a huge difference in price between where it's being released now and what it's going to be like in another year's time when it's on the market, which is why you're not seeing it, even though they're really good prices this year. And the wines are, generally speaking, there are some delicious wines, but we are not seeing a massive rush for, oh my God, I've got to buy En Primeur, because everybody knows the financial system being what it is right now, prices are not going to rise over the next year. So there's less urgency to buy Bordeaux. What was happening in 2009 and 2010 was it felt like there was an urgency to buy because of this big market, China, sat there. So they felt that they could raise their prices and people would buy. And to be fair to them, they probably thought they were going to keep rising, but that wasn't what happened. They priced too highly and prices dropped as a result. Do you know what's also fascinating about all of this pricing question around En Primeur is a lot of it is really for psychological reassurance, not for anything else, because most of us, we're not going to resell those wines. Most people, if we're buying, say if I buy a case of, I don't know, Leoville Barton, which is a delicious wine and relatively at a reasonable price, if I buy that, I'm not looking to resell it. I'm looking to keep it and drink it myself. But all the same, you don't want to know that it's dropped 50% in price since you bought it. But I think really the amount of En Primeur that's resold is pretty tiny. And yet we're all so bothered about what the prices are.
Isn't that funny? So what do you think, in conclusion, with all of this going on, the economics, the politics, what's the future of En Primeur? Is it going to continue? Is it important for Bordeaux?
The hard thing is they've got so used to it as a system. They've got so used to that idea of everybody's looking at Bordeaux at that one time in the year, which is very helpful for how Bordeaux is sold through the rest of the year. But at the same time, the chateaux haven't helped themselves because they're keeping more and more wine back at the estates to sell later. One of the reasons they're doing that is so that they can price their wines more highly because they're limiting the amount that's going out onto the market. Oh, because I didn't even finish, sorry, about how they're going to be pricing. So they're pricing about global economic, but they're also pricing about how is their brand sat compared to all the other brands. So if you're a San Julian and you want to know how are my neighbors pricing and how do I look compared to my neighbor? And so those other questions are also what comes into this pricing question. So so they're not helping themselves by all of that. It cannot continue if they don't allow other people in the chain to make any money. The reality is, if Berry Brothers have to spend 2 months of putting all of their top salespeople on selling Bordeaux, there has to be some margin in it for Berry Brothers. And the way that it's working at the moment is if the Bordeaux chateaus are taking too much of that margin out at the beginning, then you're not going to be able to convince these merchants around the world to spend the amount of time that it takes to call all of their top collectors and say, do you want to buy XYZ chateau? So I do think it is a dangerous time right now for the En Primeur system. And I think Bordeaux should really wise up and understand how good they've had it really for the last 4 decades and what a benefit to Bordeaux it is having this system. So yeah, we'll see. When it works, it's really fun and it's a great way to buy.
Watch this space.
Watch this space, definitely.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, let's talk in a decade. Now, stay tuned for next week as Jane talks about the Bordeaux Pirates, some of the smaller wineries that we need to know about, who's pioneering the organics and biodynamic winemaking practices, what trends are happening that we don't know about, and lesser known grape varieties that are being planted and being experimented with. So a real insider's look into the Bordeaux wine region. And so I shall leave you with just a wine quote as we finish off. And this is from Nick Mason, who was an English drummer famous for being in the band Pink Floyd. And he said, "Buying a Ferrari is like buying Chateau Pétrus. If you like fine wines, it is the safe choice." Sadly, I can't afford either. But remember, next week's episode, we'll learn which ones have great value and ones we can purchase. Now, if you are loving these episodes, don't forget to subscribe, like, leave a comment, leave a rating. All of this helps the podcast become far more discoverable, and share it with your wine-loving friends. Wishing you an absolutely gorgeous week. Love and light to you all. Until next Monday, wine friends. Cheers to you.